I'm Scott Wilson. I'm reader at the University of Birmingham, where I teach composition and electronic music and multi-channel audio. I'm here today at DBS Bristol to talk about experimental multi-channel audio and music, specifically to talk about B.E.A.S.T, which is short for Birmingham ElectroAcoustic Sound Theatre, which is a presentation system for electronic music that was founded in 1982 by my now retired colleague John T. Harrison. Okay, hi. I'm Scott Wilson, so I'm here from the University of Birmingham. I might have a lovely title there, Reader in Electronic Music, which sounds probably like I do a lot more reading than I actually do. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about experimental multi-channel audio and music, and specifically about this thing called B.E.A.S.T, which I'm the director of there, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. So I gather everybody here is people doing different sorts of things, audio production, live sound, this sort of stuff. So I've gathered, I wasn't really sure exactly who would be in the room, so I've gathered together like quite a lot of different slides and material. We'll see how far we get. If anything's totally obvious, we can skip over it or something like that, but we'll see how we do. Does that sound all right? At the end, I'm going to play a little bit of music, just because I think actually, I always do these talks about multi-channel audio, and then you never get to actually hear any, because it's just stereo or something, so I thought that would be nice, but right. So B.E.A.S.T. I'll kind of use B.E.A.S.T as the kind of way into this topic. So B.E.A.S.T is short for Birmingham ElectroAcoustic Sound Theatre, which was started by my former colleague, well, retired colleague, I should say, John T. Harrison. He started it in 1982. So it's been around for, what is that now, 37 years? Yeah. So it's heading towards 40. It's heading towards sort of middle age, really, but still youthful in some ways. And what B.E.A.S.T is it's a kind of large-scale presentation system for multi-channel electronic music, or we would say electroacoustic music. So I don't know if you guys have you heard the term electroacoustic before? Yeah, probably you have. So I mean, it's a funny term that I think it comes really from communication studies, but it often gets used. Certain sorts of people like to call what they do electroacoustic, and other people like to call it electronic. But I think we're probably talking about something that's coming out of loudspeakers. And B.E.A.S.T is indeed a whole lot of loudspeakers. This is a kind of dark and moody photo, but typically in a large B.E.A.S.T setup, it might be something like 100 loudspeakers. So I used to, when I'm trying to explain this to people who've never experienced this before, I'll often say, you know what 5.1 is. There's a 5.1 system in this room, right? So you've got 5 loudspeakers and 1 subwoofer, 5 full-range loudspeakers and 1 subwoofer. So B.E.A.S.T might be 90.8 or something like this, right? In its sort of current incarnation. And that's something that's developed over the years, and has kind of changed as practice has changed. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And it's also, there's a number of systems that are similar to this around the world. There's been a kind of, in the last 10, 15 years, I think, an explosion of people doing more systems. There's been actually quite a few in the UK that were kind of established. I don't think I'm tooting our own horn too much here by saying on the B.E.A.S.T model. I think that's probably fair. There's others that have been sort of established on other models. So it is a kind of hot topic. B.E.A.S.T is also, I think, relatively unique amongst those, though, in that it's also a touring system. So it actually gets loaded up onto trucks and taken off to different places. So we've done concerts in Berlin and Aix-en-Provence and Plymouth and elsewhere in Birmingham. We've been about 7 years now in a new building at the university, which has a concert hall, which is called the Elgar Concert Hall. It's named after that Elgar because he was the first professor of music at Birmingham. So we must remember this forever, even though he didn't really like it and he left. I don't think he didn't like the university. He just didn't like teaching, I think, actually. But But that hall was made in part with B.E.A.S.T in mind, which is really a wonderful thing. I mean, if you think about large performance spaces that are really designed for amplified electronic music, is not very many of them really. So that's like, this is actually at the CBSO Center in Birmingham, where it's actually the orchestra rehearsal hall, but it's also a concert space, and that's where we used to do stuff before we moved into the building. Right, I've got a few more photos of this. So that's just an old setup there. You can sort of see this is the kind of mixing control desk, and those in that version there were Mackie control surfaces that we were using. This was a kind of earlier version of an early incarnation of B.E.A.S.T as a kind of digital system. In the old days, it was all analog, of course, and those we needed some kind of controllers, and they were, well, we had a bunch of them, and they don't cost that much. They're not great, but they did the job. You can see here a little bit better. And it's a notoriously difficult thing to take photos of, because it's really a bunch of small black boxes, with enigmatic green lights on them. But you can see here some of the more unusual things, which are, for example, these tweeter trees, which are hung over the audience. So there's different speakers which are high frequency only, so sort of like the opposite of subwoofers, if you like. If anybody has any questions about any of this, by the way, please just leap in and stop me. And in those days, we used to hang those on wire rope, which was a terrible, terrible faff. We don't do that anymore. So there's also sort of this history of kind of specialized speakers. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that kind of developed. This is one of the few good photos in Copenhagen at the Sound Around Festival. We had a lighting designer who put in some mist for us. This is a really challenging concert that we did on another tour in Rose Garden in Aix-en-Provence. They have a festival there every summer called the Sidewalk Music Festival, which is really nice. And a Rose Garden is an absolutely beautiful place, of course, to do a concert. Who would not want to do a concert outside in a rose garden in the summer in the south of France? Except that there's roses in the middle, which of course is where you would like to put the audience and the desk and everything. So we had to be quite creative about how we were going to do that. And try to get a good experience for everybody. And this is one of the things that comes out of being a touring system, and actually really out of this whole particular kind of, if I can say, tradition of approaching multi-channel audio, is this pragmatic adaptability, right? Which is different, I think, from a lot of other approaches to multi-channel audio, which really come from a kind of engineering perspective, which are, in some sense, perhaps trying to recreate a particular sound field in a kind of idealized way. This is not necessarily trying to do that in the same way exactly. Does that sort of make sense? Hopefully it will make more sense as we go. This is also in Copenhagen. That's jaunty at the back there. We got some nice trusses to hang things off of, so we didn't have to use much wire rope anymore. This is another challenging space in Plymouth University, where we did a concert. That's actually a water feature in the middle there, which those of you who do live sound know water features are always great when you're doing live sound or any kind of amplified sound. Gratuitous road cases, gratuitous wires and amp racks. This is in our new space, well, new, 7-8 years old now, Elgar Concert Hall. As I mentioned, very flexible, so the acoustic is actually really, really adjustable. So you can make it, it's a 450 seat at its most concert hall. Well, I think it's certainly the nicest concert hall of that size in the city. And it's, I think it's it's got to be one of the nicer ones in a university in the country, I think. We're really blessed with that. But the acoustic is incredibly flexible. So if you really open it all up, take out all of the damping and everything, raise up all the canopies, you can see these canopies here, which are quite adjustable. And there's reverb chambers. If you do all that, it's almost like a cathedral. It has quite a long reverb. I've never timed it, so I don't really know what it comes to, but you'd be quite happy with a big choir in there or something. And if you put all the damping in, it's actually too dry for us, which was a surprise. one of the things they wanted to use the space for was prestige lectures as well, and we thought it wouldn't work, but it does because they can get it that dry. But we found when we went in there that we thought the first thing we did was put in all the damping, because we thought, what do you want for a really big space for electronic music? You want a really dry space, right? And everybody thinks that because they haven't had a really big, really dry space. It makes everything seem very small, seem very remote. It turns out that what's good for music is also good in moderate doses for electronic music, things like early reflections and all these kind of things that we design the acoustics of performance spaces and presentation spaces for in moderation. You want less of it than you probably want for other things, but some. And it's always nice to start with some pictures. Here's the obligatory panorama shot, gives you some taste of that. And we also do things, we do a lot of just electronic music of various sorts, but we also do things with instrumental performers. And we also do things with, a lot of what we do comes out of this kind of fixed media music tradition, which used to be called tape music, because you may have seen these things in museums or in old black and white films from before I was, you know what I mean. But we also do things with live performance. This is a laptop ensemble that we had there, which does live coding. Anybody ever know what live coding is? Yeah? So live coding, what's live coding?
So you use code to make music live. I have a friend that does it.
No, that's good.
Certain type of it anyway. And
yeah.
He goes up on stage and then programs everything live sequentially. And
So it's making music using algorithms that you can rewrite while they're running is the usual shorthand way that people say it. So we're doing things like that too. That actually over there on the end is me in an earlier, less beardy life. And here's a quite recent photo. Again, you can see the tweeter trees now hung from this sort of truss square that we have. And this is a quite nice photo taken by somebody better than me, which gives a sense of what it might be like to be at a concert. So the tape music thing, this is something that came out that people were interested in the early days of electronic music. Of course, people were always doing things live with electronic instruments and experimental instruments and devices and things. But to do certain sorts of things, it was hard to do them in real time. So people got into this idea: we'll put stuff on tape, and we'll multi-track or we'll mix or whatever, and we'll have a finished tape, and then your piece exists not as a song that everybody knows how to play in your band, or not as a score, but it exists as this fixed media thing on tape. And there's interesting aesthetic things that go along with that too, because some people got really interested in the idea of like perfection, right? Like we can get it just the way that we want it, right? And then there was a backlash against that, and people wanted to do things live and improvise and stuff together. So there's all these different threads going through. But what might be one of the problems actually with like just playing tapes in concerts? Anybody ever been to a concert like that? Yeah?
It's not that interesting to look at.
It's not interesting to look at, yeah. Yeah, so now this is where some people would get very high-handed about this and say, well, you should only care about the purity of the sound, right? But it's an interesting point, right? And there's also it gives you some things, but it takes some things away. And some people found it a bit nihilistic to be looking at an empty stage. So this idea of like a loudspeaker orchestra was one of the reasons people started doing that was as a way to deal with that. So you use this loudspeaker orchestra to make a more varied, more immersive experience that feels more like something that's worth leaving your house for, rather than just listening to it on headphones or on your hi-fi or home. Yep.
Yeah, but I suppose the thing with B.E.A.S.T and other sort of large speaker arrays is that the speakers almost become a presence.
Yeah.
They're really replacing performance because of their sheer number.
Yeah.
As opposed to
Sometimes people light them. Actually, yeah. And particularly if they have quite interesting looking ones, it's kind of there's different schools of thoughts of that. I actually, some people like to close their eyes. I actually like to make a nice atmosphere and have some lights. But there is this kind of sense of some sort of more immersive or more dramatic experience that you're getting. And sometimes people compare it to cinema. So when you go to the cinema, nobody's doing anything and you're just watching a fixed media thing, but nobody seems to have a problem with that. So there is these different kinds of ways of thinking about it. And partly I think it's cultural too. Like people weren't used to it, so therefore I think people find it less problematic now, or there seem to be more people who find it less problematic now. Or people are more used to seeing DJs, for instance, than when this started. And of course, what do people say about DJs? They say, oh, they're not really doing anything. They're just checking their email. They say the same thing that they say about this. So it's kind of, so maybe they haven't accepted it, but at least they're used to it, But anyway, so we try to make a nice experience. And this is just with the lights on so you can see. And I was going to say actually that, when I said the subtext of me saying that it's hard to take a photograph of it is that it is actually kind of impressive, to be in it's a big room. It goes very high. There's stuff all around you, but in a photograph, it's a bit hard to see, get the sense of that. Right. Any questions about any of that before I move on? No. I was just going to mention that this is not like totally unique, right? It wasn't a total innovation. We've had ideas about presenting music in spatial ways before, and there were a number of, some of these go way, way, way back, and embody a number of different concepts. So this is, anybody know what that is? Yes, it is St. Mark's, which it occurred to me is probably almost bizarrely empty at the moment, unusually because of what's going on in Italy. But you know about these galleries here? So there's a kind of a tradition there, what they call polychoral music, and they would put separated choirs in the galleries, and they would sing antiphonally, so they would alternate and sing back and forth to them. And so this was a common example that people use of a kind of spatialized music that was using space to create a more immersive experience. Of course, the reverberance of cathedrals are another example of creating a more immersive experience because you're getting a lot of decorrelated sound coming from different directions already. And this has certain sorts of effects. We know when we hear things coming from different directions because of the way we do kind of spatial scene analysis in our minds, it's easier to separate things out than when they're together. And this is quite interesting music by composers like Gabrieli and whatnot. Here's another one that's kind of interesting. I've actually got a little bit of sound here. This is TUVAN music. Anybody ever heard TUVAN music? There's a really nice it's a piece called Kızıl Taiga, Red Forest. Let's see how this goes. So do you hear what's happening there? Yeah. So what's he doing? Yeah. So he's singing in the mountains across the valley in front of a big, huge cliff where they know they get an echo. And TUVAN music, traditional TUVAN music is actually quite interesting in that it's very environmentally specific. They have songs to sing next to creeks and rivers. They have songs to sing in the mountains where there's cliffs and you get the echo. They call those ones long songs because there's always pauses so that you can hear the echo coming back. They have songs that you're supposed to sing on horseback. I heard an amazing talk some years ago by somebody who did some of the first recordings of this stuff. And it was funny because, of course, it was sort of, post-Stalinist state. They were all put in kind of official kind of fake traditional uniforms, and they became kind of on TV. And he sort of took them back out into, the musicians back out into the wild parts of Tuva and said, oh, yeah, we used to do this song here. And they go there and they go, okay, this is why there's pauses in this, because you need to hear the echo. But it's a very spatially aware kind of music in that sense. And I mentioned that partly just because it's a different idea. It's a different idea of space, right? Like it's interacting with an environment. And I try to encourage people when you think about space to think about space in multiple different ways, not just stuff coming from different directions, which I think is often in the kind of technical audio world is something that we kind of, that's the first thing we think about, is sort of vector, right? Is it here or here? Panners make us think that way as well, don't they? Maybe you guys don't think that way. I shouldn't jump to conclusions, but right. Another classic example was Edgar Varèse's poem Électronique. Have people heard of this before? So this is a famous installation, actually. It's basically a kind of multimedia installation, which was at the World's Fair in 1958 at the Philips Pavilion. I won't say a ton about it, but more than 400 loudspeakers with 12 different trajectories of sound going across the inside of this pavilion, which was designed by the avant-garde architect Le Corbusier. And there were a number of things like this which were really like bespoke, ad hoc things. And this had an astonishing number of people went through this, actually. And there was a whole team of Philips engineers who were on call pretty much 24 hours a day while the thing was running, just to keep it running. It was, really, really insanely ambitious for the time. Now it's much easier to do this stuff. And so it's a lot of these early ones really were sort of like kind of really idiosyncratic one-offs, yeah? Here's just an example. This is Pierre Schaeffer, I believe, at the French radio. And we're going to talk a little bit more about him in a minute. But this is a kind of early spatial controller. So he's holding some kind of magnetic device, and proximity to these rings basically controls how much of the signal that they're putting into this device is sent to a set of loudspeakers whose positions correspond to the directions of the ring. Yeah, so it's basically like a kind of panner, like a kind of amplitude panner, right? So this is an interesting, like, how do you control this stuff once you want to have multi-channel sound, once you want to do direction, for example. And conversely, we can kind of do it the other way. This is Karlheinz Stockhausen. Anybody heard of Stockhausen? Yeah, so he's quite a character. But this is a device that was invented at the West German radio for his piece Kontakte, which was a piece for 4-channel tape, percussion, and piano. And basically, this is a loudspeaker that's on a rotary table. And the kind of the cone makes it directional, and you can see there's 4 mics around. And so he spatialized literally by turning the table around like that, which is quite fun, quite strange. And then there's this idea of this Acousmonium, which brings us back to Schaeffer. And Schaeffer is quite an interesting character. He had all sorts of interesting ideas about sound and the abstract nature of sound. So he had this idea of the sound object, which is really to do with its, so a sound that's understood really in terms of its timbre and its kind of how that changes over time. Now sometimes people would use the word spectromorphology. Yeah, so how does the spectrum change over time? Do people know what I mean when I say timbre? Yeah? Anybody not know that? So I mean, if I go, la, then you sing the same note. That wasn't the same note. But if it was the same note, so if we were to say that, if we had an oboe and a piano play the tuning A, for example, timbre would be, to a large extent, what was different between the two things, right? It's the tone color, but it's a complicated multimodal thing, timbre, right? Like, it's a complicated percept. We have lots of things going to that. It is the spectrum and how it changes over time, but it's also things like onset transients are very important for identifications of timbre and things like this. So he gets really, really into this idea of timbre as the kind of like last frontier of music, right? Because we've had pitch, rhythm, harmony, form to some extent, all this stuff, but timbre was like was the thing for the 20th century, right? Like, that was really, really getting pushed. And you can see this in other ways, right? With like the increase in size of the orchestra, the growth in percussion music. Electronic instruments are just one part of a bigger thing in that sense. But so he's doing that. He's interested in timbre. You want to make these complicated pieces that have all these different processing of sound and have different timbres. So you're making these tape pieces, these fixed media pieces. How are you going to present them? So he comes up with this idea of an Acousmonium, which is pairs of different loudspeakers, and he treats them sort of instrumentally. And so here's it's not a very good photo, I apologize, but you can see, like, this is, at the hall that they have at the French radio, which is still there, I think. And they've just got, like, just a mountain of different loudspeakers. Yeah? And it's, and some of them I can't quite see, but they have these ones that are sort of like round ones, and they have ones that are a little bit like our tweeter trees that come out on like snake heads and things like this. High frequency ones, low frequency ones. They're not treated as neutral. When we think about a loudspeaker, what do you really want in a loudspeaker, right? You want something, sorry? Bass. Ah, yeah. I'm talking to the wrong people. So the answer that you were supposed to give was you want a loudspeaker that's transparent and flat, and and so when loudspeaker companies want to sell you loudspeakers, what do? They give you frequency response graphs, and they're supposed to be super flat, and you're supposed to go, ooh, that's really nice. But Schaeffer was not into that. He wanted ones that behaved differently, that had different characters, and so part of what he's doing here is about space, but a lot of it is also about playing different parts of pieces on different combinations of different loudspeakers with different characters. So there's sort of like instruments, yeah? And the space thing kind of grows a bit out of that. And interesting things happen when you do that, right, that lend themselves to space. So one thing, for instance, is that if you have loudspeakers which do have different frequency responses, for instance, perhaps drastically different frequency responses like high frequency tweeters, and let's say that those tweeters happen to be closer to you than, say, the other loudspeaker, and you turn up both of them, you get this kind of spectral splitting effect, they call it, which is, so basically you'll hear the high frequency stuff coming from the tweeters, and you hear the rest of the stuff coming from somewhere else. So you're already getting a kind of spatialized effect there just from that. Does that make sense? Yeah? Another point, which Jonty, my colleague, was always fond of making, was that the other reason that people started doing this stuff with loudspeakers is because tape was noisy. Tape was really noisy, right? So you had a big noise floor, and the dynamic range wasn't really what you'd ideally want. It's not great. Now it's much, much, much better, of course, with digital systems. So one of the reasons to do stuff like this is to turn things up when it gets louder, and you turn it down when it gets quieter, because your signal-to-noise ratio is so much better when it's louder and you don't hear the hiss. And that leads naturally, in fact, to something that becomes part of the practice of systems of this sort, of which B.E.A.S.T is, to a very large extent, is one, although not only. Which is that when you interpret your piece on a system like this, you are responding to what is already there. So amplitude is an obvious thing. If the piece is getting louder, yeah, you make it louder. And you don't need that anymore for the hiss, but you still tend to do that. You tend to follow the shapes of it. If the piece sounds busy, you get busy. If the piece sounds like it's moving, you might want to make it moving. And it's actually an interesting point to also say about spatial audio systems, is that timbre is super, super, super important. It's super important in terms of making something in terms of making it seem like something's moving. I could just tell a brief anecdote as an aside. Has anybody ever heard any of these pieces by John Chowning? They're old quadraphonic pieces. So they were from the 80s. He was the guy who invented FM synthesis, which you might have heard of. And they were really, at the time, everybody was so impressed with how good they are, because there was basically there was some panning, and there was also a local reverb and a general reverb and Doppler effect. So people know what Doppler effect is? Anybody not know what Doppler effect is? It's basically, it's the thing when the car drives by and the pitch drops, right? And that's something, we hear that, we always think movement. If it does that, it's moving, right? And I went to a talk at a place in Germany some years ago, and a guy named Volkmar Hein, who used to teach some of this stuff in Berlin, was giving a talk, and he played the opening of one of these Chowning pieces. We were sat in a long shoebox lecture theater with speakers right at the corner, so quite close to us. Quad, you may know, you don't generally do equal power panning across more than about 60 degrees, right, because you tend to get a hole in the middle. So the configuration is already not ideal. The setup in particular where we're listening is less than ideal even for quad. And he plays the opening of this piece, and we all go, yeah, Chowning, sounds good, we've heard it before, it still holds up, it's amazing how good it is. And then he says, no, I'm going to play it again. And he plays it again. And he says, what changed? And we could hear qualitatively that it was a bit different, but it really wasn't clear to us what happened. And he told us after, he says, what happened is after the first gesture in the piece, I played everything else in mono. And I just tell this story because to make this point about timbre, because that was one of those moments in my life where I just thought, okay, everything I thought I knew, I'm wrong about. You know, this trumps everything. And spatial hearing is multimodal and complicated and contextual. And if you hear, and we're used to being confused in the modern world in the 21st century. And if you hear something that sounds like it's moving, you'll think it's moving because that's the best interpretation. Sorry, little aside on that. So what people tend to do with systems like B.E.A.S.T, classically at least, is this thing called diffusion. And so the idea is that you have a controller of some sort. This is usually some kind of mixer or fader board or something like this. And you, in the classic sense, you would have a stereo signal, although it could be more channels than stereo. And you're using those faders to route that signal to different pairs of speakers in different combinations to interpret your piece. Does that sort of make sense? You can imagine how that would work? Sometimes people who do audio engineering just go, oh my God, but phase cancellation and everything else and all this good stuff. And so if anybody wants to take a moment just to absorb that, it's okay. Actually, this, so again, I say these approaches are pragmatic. But one of the reasons I say they're pragmatic is they actually, they tend to make a virtue of things that other people would consider a problem. So yes, you get localization, blur, and image dispersion and decorrelation from doing stuff like that. But that actually, contributes to an increased sense of immersiveness and spatiality. And it's interesting also to think that compared to something like a lot of spatial audio approaches, which again are trying to make a particular image for for an idealized listener. And I would even include just normal pan pots for that, right? They kind of assume you're sitting between the two speakers and, that's the idea. This implicitly or explicitly makes hopefully a good variety of spatial issues from a variety of positions, but they're not the same for everybody, right? Because it depends where you're sitting. And it exploits things like the spectral splitting thing that I meant, and so a couple other things we'll talk about, like Precedence effect and Franssen's effect, which we'll get to in a little bit. Yeah. So basically, you take your piece, you've got your stereo signal, and you're routing it around to different pairs of speakers, probably almost always more than just one. So, and I'll just give you an idea of the history of how B.E.A.S.T kind of developed. And this is, I have to thank Jonty for some slides. So these are kind of old, funky slides, but he has this nice kind of build-in. So you start out, so this is his, your kind of stereotypical shoebox concert hall, and you've got your mixing position there, or your diffusion position, as we might call it, in the stage. And so you start out with your basic stereo pair that you've got there as a kind of mains. But I mentioned this thing about, when you go beyond 60 degrees, right? You get a hole in the middle, right? If you're panning beyond 60 degrees, right? And depending on where you're sitting in that hole, your experience, how wide those speakers are, depending how forward or back you are, can vary, yeah? So they immediately try to add a second wide pair, which is a bit closer. So if you're sat up the front here, you're probably hearing there, and if you're sat back, you're going to hear those two. So you get a bit of phase cancellation and a bit of image dispersion, which again, by making things a little bit, by giving you some contradictory spatial clues, actually, it's sometimes better that things are equally wrong than that everything is perfectly right. A little bit of confusion goes a long way. But you get, it allows you to give both a narrow and a wider space stereo image, but also, gives you different people in different places a good stereo image. Does that make sense? And then he adds in another pair of speakers, which are off-axis speakers. Now, I don't imagine that anybody here's ever, well, I don't know, do you ever tell them to point speakers off-axis? You do live sound?
No.
No.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. So why might we want to have speakers off-axis? Yeah?
Reverberations or something like that?
Yeah. So when the speaker is off-axis, what you're going to do is change the balance of the direct sound from that speaker and the room sound, the reverberant sound from that speaker, right? So it's a little bit like you turned up a reverb knob, but it's also, it's more diffuse. It's less localized, right? And it's also got a different character. So in a way, like by just taking, assuming these were all the same model of speaker, just by doing that, you've got something more like Schiffer's thing that's a bit more character. And this is often where like people who are like serious hardcore sound engineers sort of start really, really, you do that? You take those really expensive speakers and point them off axis? Sometimes I'm afraid, yes, we do. Yeah. And then he puts a couple of speakers at the back, so that you can have the sound seeming to come from the back. And this is what, this was the original version of B.E.A.S.T. It was an 8-speaker system. And it was, to be honest with you, they weren't actually in the early days all the same model of speaker. It was whatever 8 speakers you could manage to cobble together with your friends. This used to be called the kind of, is what John used to call the B.E.A.S.T main 8. And so, by playing around with that, you could have a distant sound that was more diffuse. You could have wide and narrow stereo. You could have it come from the back, and you could do sort of things in between and a little bit mixed. Yeah? Any questions about that? Yep.
When you say off axis, you just mean not pointing in the same direction as the other speakers?
Yeah. So if you were to look at the spec for the speakers, there would be, if you took a kind of an angle pointing out from the middle of it, there would be a width that they would say that the sound is relatively flat on. Right. Yeah. Okay. And so when you go outside of that, one thing happens is that the spectrum changes, and if they're turned off axis enough, right, then you'll end up hearing more reverberant sound. So for instance, really, like if you just turned them around and pointed them at the wall, you'd hear all reverberant sound, right? And we actually do that. I apologize. At least you're laughing, that's good. Right. Maybe it's just a good moment to say that another reason to do things like that is actually adapting your piece to a particular performance space. Because again, these kind of engineering approaches have a kind of idealized idea about what's going on in the room that you're playing it in, but in the real world, the room isn't necessarily ideal. We did actually the festival in Berlin, Volkmar, who I mentioned, brought us, and he put us in this thing called the Elisabethkirche, which was an old church that was bombed out in the war and then was rebuilt. It's a concert space. It's beautiful. It has a 7-second reverb. It was terrible for electronic music. It's really, really difficult, right? So we had to kind of work with that. Like, how can you make this drier? You would do a lot less of indirect speakers in a place like that. And then you can just start extending this. So I don't know. Let's add some subwoofers or something and put them around the space. And before people say, "Oh, you can't tell where stuff is coming from the subwoofer," empirically, I can say that to some extent you can. Actually, I mean, if it's a big enough space, depends what happens, depends what's going on, but I mean, it does make a bit of a difference. I think I'm probably more modest in my allocation of subwoofers than some other people would be, but there you go. And we could add the tweeter trees hanging over the audience's head that you saw in the picture. And then you can sort of keep going from there. Oh, let's do some funny ones. These ones are actually a really handy one in terms of diffuseness. So they would call those, he called those side fills. And what you tend to do with those is like just turn them up a little bit and kind of leave them there. And the reason is that actually fading from the front to the back smoothly and making that sound like a smooth motion is actually quite a hard thing to do convincingly. So by making it a little bit worse in terms of its localizability, it actually smooths that out. Yeah? It's kind of funny. Let's do a weird one where we have a stereo pair where there's one at the front and one at the back, just as a special effect. Let's have a really diffuse one that kind of floods the front of the stage. Let's have a very narrow stereo pair at the front. They used to call those punch. And we can kind of keep going. We can add high ones or all sorts of different things. Really super, super diffuse ones at the back. And so on and so forth. Any questions about any of that before I move on? No? Okay. And this, I love that fade. That's also, I copied this from one of John T's presentations. So it's, this is, so how do you do that when you start getting that many speakers? How many mixers have, 32 buses out or things like this, right? So actually, They had at one point some custom things made. This was called the 3D. It was made by a company called DAX, which is in the UK. And it's basically a mixing board in reverse. Yeah, so instead of having, you know, a bunch of inputs and 2 outputs, you have a bunch of outputs and 2 inputs. And it had up to 32 output channels, and it lasted a surprisingly long time. I've been in Birmingham since 2004, and I was present for the last concert that this was used in. It got modified at various points to allow for multi-channel inputs to some extent, so people started doing more channels of input than just stereo at some point. But it was all analog. It was, you know, sort of held together with Velcro and hope, and it did reach a certain point where it was just not really sustainable to keep it going anymore. And then the other thing that happened is the system got bigger, even bigger than that. As when people started doing more multi-channel, they felt like they needed even more. And then it was also just became impossible to control and impossible to repatch. Because you can imagine what something like this would be like if you had to repatch it between every piece or something. It'd just be a nightmare, right? But I think it's a great looking thing. It's kind of something. It's something I look back on it with a certain amount of nostalgia. I mean, the days of, like, you know, really sort of like funky, ambitious custom hardware. I mean, you get that in the kind of the instrument building scene now, but not so much in the kind of audio presentation scene in the same way anymore. You know, just briefly, you know, people do start to move into diffusing with more channels. And so you can start to see one thing that happened, interestingly enough, in the kind of experimental music world and universities and things, is one of the formats that came out was a ring of 8 channels. So not 5.1, but a ring of 8. And there's different reasons for that. One of them was, you know, in the 90s, the availability of ADATs and whatever the Tascam one was called. Was it DA88? Anybody? Must be somebody here who remembers those. Can't be the only one. You know, so there was commodity hardware that could do 8-channel recording quite, you know, that was relatively affordable, right? There's another reason, you know, compared to things like 5.1. You know, 5.1 is really a cinema format, for example. So, you know, panning across that gap is not really ideal, right? Because that's more than 60 degrees. So this is more even. And yeah, this sort of makes sense. And if you want to diffuse 8 channels, well, you need more speakers than that. So you might have, instead of that front 4, you could replace them with a more distant front 4. So you could have a bigger ring. Let's have a high ring that's over the audience so that you can make the sound seem to go up. Let's have one that's offset, which is a format that some people in the US were using. Or a more distant one that's offset. Or tweeters in 8 channels. Or how about you have your ring of 8 channels and you put them up on a stage over there. They called that opera stage. That was a brief fad in B.E.A.S.T. I don't think it really lasted that long, but you know, it's an interesting idea. And again, you can sort of see this is quite pragmatic, quite ad hoc, quite creative, right? Like, it's not like saying my piece has to sound exactly like this. We're saying if you want to have your, you know, ring of 8 speakers, but suddenly you want it to be way over there with you outside of it, if you think that sounds okay, why not, right? Subwoofers, and how about a bunch at the desk that are pointing outwards so that it seems like it's in the middle of the audience, and how about a diffuse one, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. And it gets a bit crazy at some point. Yeah. So that's how we kind of got to the point where we had 100 loudspeakers. Because, you know, if you have an 8-channel piece, for example, and bear in mind now people are doing 16 or 60 channels or something like this, you know, you need more options. So if you needed 4 pairs to start with, maybe, you know, just 4 times 8 is already 32 speakers, right? And I've just got you know, 1 or 2 examples of setups that we've done which are a bit different in different spaces. This is, I think, actually the Elizabeth Curta in Berlin. That's the CBSO Center, which has several rows of balconies up the side, so you can do a lot with with height. And this is actually the plan that we generally use now for the festival, and that's the layout of the Elgar Concert Hall. And you can see again, we put some speakers in the reverb chambers that are in that concert hall that I mentioned, so you can really have something that sounds like it's in another room if you want. Some of these things are quite special effects, maybe not everybody's going to use them. But yeah. And then again, you can say, well, okay, I told you that the 3D kind of died and anyway wasn't big enough, so how do you control these things? Well, we ended up having something built. This was we have a tradition in Birmingham. I don't really know why it keeps happening, but we have a tradition of working names that end up getting stuck and just sticking. I mean, I don't know, maybe B.E.A.S.T was even one of them. But so we were trying to get these controllers made, and the working name was Motor B.E.A.S.T. And now that's just stuck, I'm afraid. So, and these were made for us by a guy named Sukandar Kartadanada. He's an engineer, lives in Germany. He used to have this, I don't think he really does anymore, but he had this company called Gluey, which was sort of like, you guys ever done things with Arduinos and stuff like this? So it was like proto maker movement stuff, right? Like he had his own card with his own chip on it, and he made all sorts, he made weird trumpets and things like this and all sorts of stuff for people based on his card. So he made those, he made a bunch of these boards for us with motorized faders. Oh yeah, so there's the motor going. This is his proof. He brought it, I liked the other photo because he brought it, actually the prototype, in this little suitcase which he brought with him from Indonesia when he moved to Germany. So I thought it was kind of a cute thing to do. And these use what's called the open OSC, or Open Sound Control Protocol. Do people know what that is? So it's a kind of, it's actually technically it's a messaging format. People call it a communication protocol. It's really a messaging format. And it was designed to play some of the roles that MIDI did, but in a more kind of generic and extensible way. So it doesn't tell you anything about the type of messages that you're going to send. You can make your own kind of API, if you like, your own kind of message protocol. So this one sends messages, for instance, about what the level is of each fader. There's lights that you can turn on and on. You can tell it to set the fader, various things like this. And it usually goes over networks, of some sort or other. So typically you connect these by Ethernet. And so it's completely digital. There's no audio actually goes through these devices, right? All they are is a fader that reports its position to a computer. Yeah? Yes. Yes, so he gets his little sine waves going there. Interestingly enough, I mean, we had a big research project that this kind of came on the tail end of, and one of the reasons we went with the motorized faders is that we thought that, so one of the problems with doing diffusion by hand is that, like, you can't, there's only so much you can do with 10 fingers, right? You can do a lot with 10 fingers. And it is quite interesting that a lot of this stuff, I mean, people have made other sorts of controllers and devices for controlling this stuff, but fader boards seem to keep coming back. They seem to be the thing that they're not perfect for everything, but you can control a lot with them. And because I think of some of the ways that working with a system like this, where you've got the same signal going to multiple places work, it just seems to be a good way to do it. But we thought, okay, wouldn't it be nice if you wanted to do something really, really fancy, if you could automate that? And one of the demands, and I and one of my doctoral students at the time, a guy named Sergio Luca, were programming this software. And one of the demands that was put for us was, we want it to be able to diffuse live and be automated. And I think you can probably imagine, anybody who's done kind of development or run controllers or things like this, that this is like an order of magnitude more complicated than just either or, right? In fact, if it's totally automated, you don't need to move the faders at all, because you don't have issues of statefulness, yeah? So we kind of came up with this scheme whereby, like, you could pre-program some sequence in the middle, and then the lights would flash to warn you that it would, the faders were about to move in this automated sequence. And then if you grabbed them, of course, you don't want the motor to get damaged, so it had to have touch sensitivity, and it would disable the automation if you decided to grab it in the middle by mistake or whatever. And this oh, and then we actually had a problem because the firmware wasn't right, so somebody tried to use it and it didn't work. And this was never actually ever used in a performance. So it was a lot of work for nothing, but research is like that. Sometimes you have a research question and you just find out the answer is no. And that's worth knowing. And actually the big problem for us too is just, rehearsal time. If you want, because you can't really work that out in advance, your automation, you need to have the system up, you need to be able to listen to what it really sounds like. And there's just not enough time really to do that. If you had, a day to work on your piece, you could probably do it, but you don't have a day to work on your piece, We don't get the room for that long. It takes a long time and a lot of people to set it up. So, it's kind of at a premium. So it's not practical. And other things kind of overtook that sort of idea. Yeah. Any questions about that? No? And then we've got software. Somebody asked about software. So another thing that I'm involved in is the computer music language Super Collider, which some of you might have heard of. Have some of you heard of Super Collider? Yeah? Yes? No? So it's a kind of language for music and signal processing and interactive systems and stuff like this. And I'm actually also involved in just developing that. So we decided to make concert software and actually a kind of programming library in Super Collider for multi-channel stuff as part of the project. And this is a kind of earlier, a screenshot of a kind of earlier version of it. But basically, you have, you can do system visualization. You can have a matrix where you can route things, and this can be changed for every piece. So if the first piece is stereo, and the next one's 5.1, and the next one's 8-channel, and the next one has some live stuff, you just go click, and it does all of the repatching for you. Because I realized, as I said, when I was first concert I had to do with the 3D, actually Jaunty got ill, and it was actually somehow it was the concert that was about to break the camel's back, and I just thought we can't be doing that. And we've been using that. I mean, hundreds of concerts we've used that for, and it's been good actually. It's quite reliable. And it does sound file playing, it does live input. And there's a kind of, the heart of it is this kind of signal chain here, which I won't talk through, but basically you've got inputs and then you do basically routing, controller assignment, possibly some processing into EQ and stuff like that. Yeah? Okay, so when it gets that complicated, I think a digital system is really the only way you could really cope with it. And we also have a tradition of doing kind of funny research things. So this was also part of that same project that produced the software, and we would just try, strange systems. So we do like a wall of loudspeakers or something. I think these were experiments with V.E.A.P. Has anybody experienced V.E.A.P? So V.E.A.P is a thing called, it was invented by a Finnish guy named Ville Pulkki. And sorry, I'll just try to get my Finnish pronunciation right. Pulkki, you got to get every consonant. He's a mensch, actually. He's a great guy. But it's a kind of equal power panning, but it's basically equal power panning extended to like rings and spheres or hemispheres or domes or partial bits of those of loudspeakers. So between pairs and triplets of loudspeakers is basically the way it does. And what was really kind of interesting about it is that it wasn't too bothered about the location. You would feed it the information of the loudspeakers and it would come up with the best pairs or triplets that it could. And then you would just give it a direction, it would work it out. So they didn't have to be equally spaced or anything like that. So we were trying this over kind of walls and things like this. Yeah. And that's something that some people have started working with in terms of dealing with larger arrays of loudspeakers and more complicated inputs. That was one of the ways to do it. And I was just going to say that, diffusion is something that, again, sometimes people who are used to doing live sound find a little bit strange. But actually, again, as I keep sort of saying, the problems are what makes it work. And so one of the things is this thing called precedence effect, or the law of the first wavefront. And what that means is that if you have the same sound coming from two sources, or nearly the same sound, all other things being equal, you will tend to hear it as coming from the closer one. And this is why panning doesn't work and stereo doesn't work if you're not kind of more or less equally distant, in the middle, in between the two speakers, yeah? So that's something we can exploit. I think I'll skip over the little technical bits here. Although interestingly enough, for rings of 8 speakers, for instance, I once did this. These colored bands actually show what the arrival times are for, or what the areas are for each pair of speakers for which the sound is arriving within the threshold that precedence effect operates. If you get the speakers much farther away, you'll hear it as reverb, and if it's really farther away, then you'll hear it as an echo or a delay or something, right? And it turns out, you don't have to worry about this too much, but it turns out that for a ring of 8 speakers, regardless of what size it is, because it's trigonometrical, the area where all the pairs are within that threshold is about a 1 meter circle in the middle. And you can double the number of speakers, but you still only get about 2 meters, and so on and so forth. So it's actually an interesting thing. And again, it just shows things like timbre, things like ambiguity, which your brain just goes, okay, what's the most sensible sort of interpretation of this spatially, are really, really important in this stuff, because it works much better than this would seem to suggest. Yeah? And there's another thing called Franssen effect. And Franssen effect is basically says steady state sounds tend to be localized perceptually at the first arriving source and remain there even if the first arriving source later changes. So the classic way to demonstrate this, and I apologize, I didn't bring a demo actually, but if you take a sine wave and you start at mid-cycle, so you get a click at the beginning on one speaker and then very quickly pan it to another speaker, you'll tend to hear it as staying at the first one, right? And the reason is that steady state sounds are hard to localize, yeah? So your brain kind of goes, I don't understand what's going on, but it came from there. And in the real world, because we all bring to spatial hearing our knowledge and experience of being in the real world, even if the sounds are really abstract, right? The cogent explanation is that it comes from there. And you can exploit this in diffusion. So if you remember in that simple setup, you had those distant speakers. So imagine that you had something that was like with an attack and a bell sound that then continued and was kind of droned out, yeah? And you started that on those back speakers, and then you had something more busy and articulated like a rhythm or something, and you brought in the closer ones. Believe it or not, you will tend to hear it as the bell sound stayed at the back and the other ones come closer. And this is one of the funny things that people find with stereo diffusion is they can't believe that there's only 2 channels, because it seems like it shouldn't be possible, but it's because of stuff like this. Does that make sense? This is also a problem in these engineering approaches. The difference is that they're sort of hoping that doesn't happen. Anyway, right. So I make some kind of distinctions here between different multi-channel systems, which I've been hinting at all this time. And there's these kind of engineering-like ones where we're thinking about a kind of very specific spatial distribution or space, something that we're trying to create. Versus things like which are trying to adapt a piece or some material to a particular performance space. So in the first one, we might have something like a cinema system, which ideally you're sort of sitting in the middle, or things like Ambisonics and stuff, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the other ones would be things like diffusion or theater sound or something, or sound installations, which are trying to exploit what you've got in the room that you're in. So one of them is kind of ignoring the space and trying to it's trying to solve the problems of the space, and the other one is trying to exploit the problems of space. Maybe that's the fairer way to put it. And and it's not I don't mean that as a value judgment in any way, actually. It's kind of, I think those things are appropriate. And you can start to see why if you think about things like precedence effect. Like if you have a sound installation where people can just walk around a gallery or a museum or something, there is no sweet spot. Or if there is, you can't rely that anybody's ever going to be there. And then you start thinking about that diagram I did with the 1 meter circle, and you think, well, actually, even in a cinema, for example, where you've got a really finely tuned 5.1 system, you don't necessarily have very many people in the sweet spot either. So how do you make a good experience for everybody? And then we could also distinguish between approaches in which the system is transparent or invisible and approaches in which the system is treated instrumentally. So in a 5.1 system in the cinema, you're not really supposed to think about there being loudspeakers there, right? Schaeffer wants there to be loudspeakers there. B.E.A.S.T maybe we're somewhere in between, right? Like you're turning the lights down, and some sorts of pieces you might want to close your eyes and not think about the fact that there's loudspeakers. But there's different approaches to multi-channel audio, and some of them really do treat them as like you're supposed to hear that coming from a loudspeaker. Yeah, does that make sense? Yeah. And what are the kind of trade-offs which arise when you use an adaptive approach like stereo diffusion? So I've talked about this. You turn the disadvantages into advantages. You exploit what the performance space offers you. Some of those places had balconies way up high where we could put something, but you wouldn't have that in the next space. So you just kind of work with what you've got. And the pragmatic adaptability. And this is just, again, this is from in Copenhagen again. And if you just look at the trusses there with the speakers on them, because this concert was all stereo, those pairs of speakers that are hanging from the truss, which are Genelecs, not unlike these ones, they're actually all facing, towards the audience. They're not facing in a ring, around the audience. And you can just see, I've got them circled there. There's 4 pairs. And so instead of trying to create a particular spatial image, what you can do with something like that is, let's say you've got your stereo signal and you send it to all those pairs, right? Because of the axis that they're on, because of precedence effect, everybody in the audience will hear that as close to them and above them and in front of them, right? Whether they're at the front or the back, yeah? So that's different than like, this is a space and we're imagining that we're wrapping this spatial image around everybody. We're creating an effect for everybody, intimacy, right? Which is different than direction. Does that kind of make sense? Again, I'm sorry if I'm harping on this, but I think they really are quite different ways of thinking about what you might want to do. And that is, in and of itself, quite reliable. Is the stereo left and right stuff reliable? Well, it depends where you are in the row, to be fair, but yeah. Okay, I think I'm just going to skip over a little bit of this because I don't want to run out of time. And I'm probably harping on this. But so the question here is, what really matters in a multi-channel system for the presentation of music? And I don't think there has to be any one answer to that. It could vary depending on what you're doing. But to what extent does precise spatial position matter? Should we consider non-specific approaches to spatialization? And again, people tend to think when you have these panners, you have a 5.1 panner, it's about direction. But maybe that's not important for what you're doing. Maybe intimacy or distance or closeness or farness or hard to localizeness or any of these or other sorts of qualities like that matter more. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah?
So when you're saying about that, you mentioned, say, like an art exhibit or something earlier.
Yeah.
Would there be a way, obviously, of getting that system so that you could move throughout it and not really experience sort of the difference in the sound, but the soundscape still change?
Yeah. I guess, I'm a teacher, so I harp on about things. So I've been harping on about a lot of these things, these funny things like precedence effect and Franssen effect and stuff like this. And I encourage you all, actually, if you're interested in this stuff, to go and read some more about spatial hearing. Probably you guys talk about this kind of ITDs, the basic stuff, but also there's a book by Blauert, which is kind of a classic. It's good to know that stuff because at least you know what's going to work and what's not going to work. Right, and you can work around that. I was in Zurich over the weekend, and there was a very nice sound installation and video installation that was there that one of my PhD students did, and it was very well. I thought it was, it wasn't a totally dry space. It was carpeted on the floor, but reflective with hard walls and windows, and there were, I think, 8 different channels of sound, and they had speakers around the space. Small Genelecs, smaller than those, suspended. Some of them pointed off axis, some of them pointed into the room, and they also had 2 or 3 ultrasound speakers, these kind of beam-forming speakers. Have people experienced these before? So they're really interesting. So do you know what a difference tone is? Yeah, so if you play like 2, you can do this with sine wave generators. So if you just play like 2 sine waves close together in frequency, or you can do it with instruments, you'll sometimes hear another frequency under good conditions that is the subtraction of the lower frequency from the higher frequency. That's called a difference tone. And so the ultrasound ones, what they do is they encode an audio signal at higher frequencies such that when two ultrasound beams combine in the right place in the room, they create a difference tone that's audible. And the reason that you do it that way is, well, it's not to do with quality, because the quality is not good. They sound kind of not. They sound somewhere between almost sort of okay for some material and sort of horrible. But ultrasound doesn't propagate as the same way as sound at lower frequencies. It's more directional. So what you can really do is get sound that really feels like it's coming. You know, you can point them and have it seem like the sound is coming over there. The best thing to do is point it at a wall, actually. But the other thing is that when you're not kind of within the beam, you can't really hear it very much. So it's very localized, which is different than, well, I mean, these loudspeakers, for instance, are somewhat directional. Some loudspeakers, PA loudspeakers, are more directional, less so at low frequencies. You get the idea. So this worked really well in the space. The room wasn't really, probably about the same size as this room, but you could walk around because of the balance of the levels of the different signals. Proximity, as you came close to one, you'd hear it more because of the varying directionality, because of the ultrasound thing. There'd be moments where you just walk and you'd suddenly hear it as you sort of came here. It was really quite a joyful experience to walk around and explore that. It was really enjoyable. The ultrasound ones were especially fun because they bounce, because they also bounce, right? Like the beam doesn't just stop. So you'd get them in different places in the room and you could kind of crouch down and suddenly hear it over here. And so in that case, sorry, it's a bit of a long digression, but I mean, I think what they did when they set that up was really pitched it in that space really well. You know, because it was big enough and the levels were such that nothing was overwhelming everything, and you really could hear a lot of different things depending on where you stood. I knew somebody else who did an installation with those ultrasound speakers in a museum in Massachusetts called MassMocha, which used to be a big, huge collection of interconnected factories, and they had them all in the foyer, where it was actually interviews with the people who used to work there. And so when you'd go into the museum, just at certain spots in the room, you'd suddenly hear like somebody whispering in your ear about what it used to be like to work there. So things like that. It's quite cool. But again, I think that the answer is to be pragmatic, to be aware of these things, get a sense of what's going to work, know what you can really do. And I'm often shocked at how uninformed people are about that stuff. You know, they don't really know. They're trying things that just aren't going to work because they don't understand how spatial hearing works. Anyway, sorry, a bit of an aside. Right. Yeah, so I mentioned multi-channel diffusion. I'll talk quickly over this. 8 or more channels of diffusion instead of stereo to pair. So you go 8 channels to rings of 8, for example. Possibly rings, but not necessarily. You could make arbitrary arrays of things, different shapes that you want. We've also tried some weird hybrid things. I mean, in B.E.A.S.T, we've got enough speakers that you can do this. So you might have a multi-channel array and then have a stereo pair that you're also diffusing live, or specials, people sometimes call them. You know, that speaker in the 5.1 system, the reason that's there is because it's dialogue. It's supposed to ideally be behind the screen, actually, right? And you know, I often joke when we talk about audio spatialization that if you really want something to sound like it's coming from a place, put a speaker there. It works. Mono is very effective for one location. You know, so sometimes we've had people do things like that where they've got particular sounds they want to be in particular places in the room, plus a ring. And hybridization is nice. And when you have a big system like that, you can exploit the possibilities of it more. But then if you're going to play it in your 5.1 system later, you just make a different mix for that. I'll also talk just a little bit about this idea of diffuseness as opposed to directionality and location. You know, and so how a source interacts with its environment provides us with a lot of information about both the source and its environment. And the nature of those kind of cues has effects on things called spaciousness and envelopment, as well as contributing to perceived source size. And this is kind of something that's really important, I think, if you're doing any spatial audio, it's really important to think about this as in addition to location and direction, right? Like, how do you make something seem large? How do you make something seem enveloping? How do you make things like that? So there's a measure that people use, that acousticians use, called inter-aural cross-correlation, and it's the measure of the difference in signals between two ears of a person. And basically, it's a question of, what it really comes down to is how out of phase, or how in phase are the the signals arriving at each ear. So if they're, if it's -1, they're completely correlated. If it's +1, they're completely correlated, but just inverse phase. And somewhere in between, it varies. And so typically what this means is that the phase difference is different at different frequencies. Yeah? And if you think about reverberation, right? Like think about being in a cathedral. When you come into a cathedral and you hear, say somebody singing or something, and you can't see them, it sounds like it's coming from everywhere, right? And it sounds like it's around you, doesn't it? And the reason is that sound is going out and it's bouncing off. And when a sound reflects off there, it's going to combine and phase cancel at certain frequencies depending on how late the reflection is. And by the time we get into late reverb, this is just layered and layered and layered. And it's all happening differently at different frequencies in your sound. So you get this sense of this. This is something that acousticians look at when they make concert halls, because they know that concert halls that have a reasonable degree of lack of correlation interaurally are ones that people tend to find more pleasant, more enveloping, this kind of thing. And they use these words. Yeah, I think I'll skip over some of this. This is a bit more technical. But there are ways of creating this. I mean, classic ways are start putting on varying all-pass delays and things on different channels. Multi-channel granulation actually does the same thing. Do people ever play around with granular plugins? You know what I'm talking about when I say that? It's a whole other topic we could go into. And you can do FFT-based things where you start messing with the phase of different bins. I saw some FFT math on the board out there, so I thought I might as well mention that. But I won't go into the details of that too much now. Yeah, I'm going to skip over that. Any questions about any of that so far? I've got a few more things to go through, and then I'm actually, yeah, we're doing okay. And I think we'll have time to hear a little bit of music, which maybe would be nice, or at least different. So we started to get into, so the other thing, we've got these different formats. We're doing multi-channel diffusion. You've got all this stuff going on. Digital system and a software control makes this like really so much easier to deal with. And you might think like, okay, so I'm making an 8-channel piece and diffusing it. I've got a 100-channel system. Why don't I make a 100-channel piece? And in fact, you can do that. And so we started not too long after I came, looking at what we started to call massively multi-channel composition. And the interesting thing is you've got software and you've got commodity hardware. So we were using just Motu audio interfaces actually. Which were, they're not the best thing in the world, but they're cheap. You could get 24, you could, buy a rack unit, get 24 channels out. And also, if you were on the road, if it broke, it wasn't like the thing that Stockhausen was using or the thing that Schaeffer was using or even R3D. You could go to the store and buy another one, right? Which is culturally important actually for the development of this kind of work. And there has been, I mentioned this sort of like what I would consider the second wave. I mean, if you think of like Poème électronique as the first wave, but it's a one-off because it was so hard to do it. Suddenly it's like, actually, it's not that hard to do it. You've still got, interesting. It's interesting in the sense that it's been de-democratizing, in fact, though, because it means you still have to be attached to institutions, but you don't need a huge budget to do that, and it's relatively easy to keep it going. So how do you kind of deal with this? The problems are a bit different. How do you think about all these separately addressable speakers? And so when I say 100 channels, I mean like a different signal going to every one of 100 loudspeakers or something like this, or some subset of those. Yeah. And there's also these questions about how to deal with a system like B.E.A.S.T, which gives you all of these different options, but what if you would like your piece to have a life outside of that? So you also have to think about, I'm not just writing this 100 channel piece and it's going to get played on B.E.A.S.T once and never again. Maybe I'd like to be able to do it somewhere else. the next day or something. So, portability into your design and thinking and how you think about it, and actually what I sometimes call the bookkeeping of all this is really important. Right. Let's skip over this a little bit. So I've mentioned localized versus diffuse, spectrally diffuse versus spectrally fused. So one thing we've done is taken sounds and split up different frequency components to different speakers, which, by the way, is one of these ways of creating a sense of largeness, actually, and envelopment. The hardware way of doing that is with the tweeters, but you can also do it with processing. I'm sorry, I skipped over this thing of physical volume, actually, with decorrelation. And the example I always used to like to give with that is Niagara Falls, right? So if you're standing in front of Niagara Falls, what are you hearing? You're hearing more or less white noise, right? It's a broad spectrum sound. But over the whole sweep of the thing that's in front of you, you're getting the magnitudes of the spectrum are probably roughly the same, but the phase is very, very different. And because you're getting this decorrelated wave of a similar spectrum, that creates a sense of physical size. And weirdly enough, with something like Niagara Falls, you can be quite far away from it, and it still sounds big just because it has a bit of sweep. Yeah, does that make sense? And there's been, a lot of people have done research on this in quite micro ways, like looking at something like a cello and putting microphones all around it, and then getting a hexagonal array of speakers and trying to create the radiance, the sonic radiance of those objects, which is it's like the reverse of something like B.E.A.S.T, where everybody's inside. It's actually going out into the space. And some of these things I've already talked about. Okay, and then I just mentioned a little bit Ambisonics, which is kind of really, do people know about Ambisonics? So I'm just getting picking up the kind of few topics now. So Ambisonics is actually something that has a rich history in this country. I think it was actually invented here, actually. There's a large group of people up in York who used to be really into this. And it's been around for a long time, but it's kind of going through a kind of renaissance now. So Ambisonics is, is a way of dealing with an encoded immersive sound field, which could be just around the horizon, or it could be 3D. And I think the nice way to think about it is in terms of as an extension of mid-side recording technique. Yeah. So do people know what mid-side is? So what's mid-side?
A figure of 8 microphone, figure of 8 cardioids. So say for instance you've got an instrument or something in front of us.
Yeah.
You'd have a figure of 8 microphone sort of perpendicular to it, and then a cardioid facing it. So you get sort of gets a sort of 3D effect to it.
Yeah. So what does that actually give you, though, when you've got the figure of 8? Stereo width. Yeah. So the reason you've got a perfect mono signal is you've just got the cardioid. People used to be interested in this in radio, because in the old days when AM radio was mono, so you wanted to have stereo signals even. So that's an old version of the portability problem. It's not 100 channels down to 2. It's 2 down to 1. But so you've got the cardioid, or it could be an omni actually, depending on whether you care about the stuff that's not having the stuff that's behind you. And you've got the figure of 8. And the figure of 8 is more sensitive to the left and to the right. But the main thing is that also the one side will be out of phase with the cardioid, and the other side will be in phase with the cardioid. So by mixing in the two, you can kind of cancel out, and you can basically vary the stereo width. Yeah. So Ambisonics, in its simplest form, what's called first order, is basically, imagine you've got an omni instead of a cardioid. So that's your basic signal that comes in with everything from every direction. And then you've got 3 figure of 8s, one that goes left, right, one that goes front, back, and one that goes up and down, right? So by doing that, you've got basically a capture of the sound field in every direction. Yeah, does that make sense? And it turns out that you can decode that. So that's called B format, which in the first order version like that is WXYZ is the channel order. Don't worry about why they're called that. Well, the vectors and the omni, so X is left to right, front to back, and up and down. And you can actually take that encoded signal and decode it to some array of loudspeakers, some sort of arbitrary array of loudspeakers, using basically trigonometry and weighting those 4 signals in different ways, in the same way that you do with mid-side. And if you think about mid-side as basically allowing you to vary the microphone response, sort of, have a kind of varying microphone response pattern, then you can think of Ambisonics in some sense as being taking that encoded signal and saying, which virtual microphone response pattern do I want to use for the signal that's going to go to that loudspeaker? That's sort of what it is, yeah. And it reminds me a little bit about just the thing earlier of problems actually smoothing things out. A friend of mine who teaches in Derby, Bruce Wiggins, he's done some nice Ambisonics plugins and things. There's a lot of mythology around Ambisonics, and a lot of people were quite almost religious in their fervor for it. And there's a lot of actually things that weren't really true. And he would say things like, people say that Ambisonics makes the loudspeakers disappear. He says, that is, and he has this whole sequence of things where he says, something, something, something. That is the opposite of what's true. He says, Ambisonics makes the localization equally bad in every direction. And so, just to kind of reiterate the point that I was making before, what he's actually saying is that's a bit of a virtue, because it smooths it out, right? Anyway, so you can, as I've said, this is sort of what I said, you can decode it using sinusoidal functions. You can, speakers disappear. Think of it as a virtual mic signal. One point I like to make is there will sometimes talk about energy vectors and stuff like this, and there's the right amount of energy coming from the right direction, and they'll draw these pictures with what they say are huge sweet spots, and it's true mathematically in terms of what they're talking about, but it does not trump precedence effect. If you're right next to a speaker in an ambisonic array, you will hear it as the sound is coming from that speaker, whether that's what you're supposed to hear or not. So I just mentioned that. But this is something that's become quite, as I said, it's having a bit of a renaissance. And the reason is actually this stuff. So as you get higher and higher up in orders, you get more and more spatial location. First order ambisonics is not really very good. It's the good way to do a field recording that's in 3D, but it's not really good in terms of precise localization. But by adding more channels of encoded signal and more orders, sort of basically which are essentially modeling increasingly weird-looking virtual microphone responses, you get more and more precision. Yeah. There's a few things to note about this. One is which, I think it's relatively easy to understand the first order thing as an omni in 3 figure eights, yeah? And actually you can do it that way. You can get 3 figure eights, and you'll sometimes see pictures of people doing this and sticking them in, trying to get them as close together as possible and doing this. And that is, of course, the problem, right? Is they're not, theoretically they should be coincident for it to really work properly, and they're not. So most first order ambisonic mics use a tetrahedron shape of some special kind of funky cardioid microphones, and then process, because they're all equally wrong. They do a little bit of funny filtering to try to phase correct across the different frequencies, and then they encode it into B format. With something like this, you can imagine, well, I'm not aware of any microphone that exists that has a response pattern like that. That's your omni, that's a figure of 8. I don't know what that is. That's a balloon animal, actually. So, so there are higher order ambisonic mics, but they're still very experimental. The problems get worse and worse. You sometimes get good spatial location, but the frequency response is a bit ugly because of all the kind of fixing that you have to do. But you can also do this virtually. You can encode things using just mathematical equations. So for things like what we're doing, where you're not necessarily recording a sound field, but you're virtually creating one, this can be very, very useful. And one of the advantages of this in terms of portability is the portability thing, because you can decode it for different arrays of speakers. You could make a 5.1 decode, you could make an 8-channel decode, you could make arbitrary ones for something like B.E.A.S.T, yeah? And the other thing that's really, really, really changed only in the last 4 or 5 years is that, that, like I said, the first order thing is relatively easy to understand. Higher order ambisonics decoding, particularly for things that are not evenly spaced arrays of loudspeaker, used to be kind of a black art. Bruce was one of the people who used to do this, and he'd, people say, oh, I need a decoder for this, and he'd kind of go into his room and he'd come out and he'd fiddle it. And really what it comes down to is like, how does it fail, right? When it doesn't work well, how does it fail? And the big innovation in a few years, in recent years has been a couple of new ambisonic decoder algorithms that people have come up with, one of which is actually based on VBAP. It creates a whole bunch of virtual VBAP speakers and works with that. That you can actually get like a VST plugin, type in the locations of your loudspeakers, and it sorts it out for you, and it's pretty good. So that used to be something that was like really highly specialized, and now it's accessible, and you can get those plugins for free actually. So that's been a big game changer for that. So it's made it accessible to a lot more people. Again, it's assuming, like stereo, that the speakers are equidistant to you. So again, precedence effect does work. But you can also use this as a hybrid in something else. So if you imagine something like, imagine having your ambisonic array or channels, and then you've got some specials that you might diffuse, but you could, put that down to an ambisonic version by just panning those in and summing them. Yeah. So there's some flexibility. Which brings me to this idea of composing in stems. So basically, this is the bookkeeping thing. You have a piece, you want to exploit the possibilities of something like B.E.A.S.T, but you want also it to be portable. So what you do is you design your piece in such a way that you have layers which are separated according to what's meaningful to you. And to just, and the thing I've been saying, all through the talk of like, this might not be just about direction or something comes back here, because you might have a high level, a higher layer, a low layer, a diffuse layer, a mobile, an intimate one, an indirect. You can define it however you want, right? Or a dialogue one like that one is. That's a special, really, isn't it? But just thinking about that and kind of keeping your plan as you put the piece together such that you can do that. And again, if you're doing music or experimental audio or something, direction might not matter. What might matter is the character of the thing. If you're doing virtual reality or a video game, then maybe direction is more important. Yeah. And you can adapt these to the system that you've got. And we also had this term that we were using for a while called N-channel composition, which is sort of the same thing as composing in stems, but it just means that they're maybe algorithmically generated so that the stem can be adapted to some different number of channel on the fly or for each realization or something. Actually, quite a lot of my pieces for a while were actually software pieces that ran in Super Collider. So when they were done, I'd go in and I'd just adjust the program a little bit, try it and see how it worked, and then play it in real time. And then here's just some kind of examples of this. These are actually, so here, for example, you've got two 8-channel stems. Let's say you've got one that's designed to be an 8-channel ring at ear level and one that's supposed to be high in some sense, so above you. Maybe it's bird sounds, maybe it's whatever it is. And on the top realization there, you've got an 8-channel ring, so you just sum them together and play them on both because that's the best you can do. Here you've got a 16-channel system, so you just map them one-to-one to say it's a low ring and a high ring, so that's perfect for you. And then here's the kind of more Beast-like setup where you've got your ear level stem and say you've got a main ring and a close ring, so you can diffuse between those. And then the high stem could go to a high ring and say you've got even a very high quad, so you could pan those channels around the very high quad as virtual speakers and diffuse between those. And maybe at some point in the piece you want it to seem high and some point you want it to seem very high or something in between. So just examples of adapting. Does that make sense? You sort of see how you could do that? One thing actually, I don't know if you all want to be experimental sound artists, maybe you probably don't, but this certainly is the kind of approach and thinking that I think, for things like even kind of like, you know, shows, industry shows and things like this, people often do kind of funky sound installations, and it's really good to have a little bit of this kind of stuff in your wheelhouse, actually. And actually, interestingly enough, I've learned a lot of funny tricks from people who do that stuff for their living. Sometimes they're really, really, I mean, creative in a way that I'm quite jealous of. Find good solutions to these things. And this is a piece by Sergio Luca example. So he had a piece that was 6-channel piece. It had 3 stereo stems. One was supposed to be close, one was going to be mid-distance, and one was supposed to be far. So here he's got the diffusion setup where he's sending the near stem to the near close speakers, mid ones and far ones. And then he actually did the same piece on what's called a wave field synthesis system in the Netherlands. You know what that is? So it's a kind of holophonic system where you can simulate things at different distance. And so he just plugged them into varying locations that were simulated. So it's adaptable, right? But because he's got a concept and he knows what he wants it to mean, he knows what the character should be, he knows what matters for him in the material that he's working with, he can adapt it. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Probably harping on a bit, but one more page of this. Actually, well, it's just maybe one more about quality. So here you've got something that's supposed to be ambient and diffuse. Maybe you plug it into the diffusion system, do a bit of processing to make it more diffuse and diffuse it between those 3 different rings there. Maybe you've got a stereo stem that you want to diffuse with that you then plug into the entire system, which in the software we have could be sending that signal to speakers that other signals are also being sent to. They don't have to be discrete. And then this sort of special one there that you're putting on some special speaker. And then this is the last slide, actually. It was just some N-channel pieces. So these are 2 pieces of mine from some years ago, which used a lot of VBAP as it happened. So the top one, basically these are the layers that it had that the software would generate out to whatever number of channels that I had, and perhaps I could also, depending on if it was VBAP, I would also have to put in what the locations of the speakers were, but that's for the expense of a bit more work, it's more adaptable. So I've got 3 horizontal only VBAP layers, so just around a horizon, but ground, medium, high, and high. I've got a 3D VBAP layer, which is like a dome. I've got a diffuse layer, which I might put on things like the speakers facing out because they're not supposed to be localized, and a high one, another dome one, and a stereo pair that's only used a couple of times when you really want just a frontal stereo image. It's actually a recording of a bee flying around, which, you know, is just good in stereo. Stereo mic pointed at a bee flying around. Can't beat that. Can't beat that. I didn't even realize. Sorry. I do apologize. The other piece is 2 VBAP domes. So actually, in B.E.A.S.T, you know, there's enough speakers that you can make sort of domes out of an inner layer and an outer layer. So you could go between those 2 things. If I didn't have that with that piece, I might collapse it down. I'm actually going to play this piece in a minute because I've got a 5.1 version of it. So I think. And then some diffuse layers, some of which are actually taking this spectrum of sounds and splitting the different partials apart and putting them in different places. And another VBAP layer. Yeah. And with that, you know, I've been able to, well, with the top one, it's done everything from multiple weird B.E.A.S.T systems with like, you know, 60 or 80 channels to 8-channel down to stereo. There is actually a stereo mix of that and it works. The other one I've got 5.1 of. I've never done a stereo mix of, although apparently they're going to do one now. So, yeah. So, yeah, I've been talking for quite a while. I think that's probably enough information. Should I play something? It's only about 10 minutes, and then. So this piece, because I, you know, well, there's a slide. There's some links, by the way, if you want them. This piece is, I think I have to come out of this now. Is called Böse, which is, it's a play on words. So Böse means evil in German. And it's based all on recordings of pianos. And there were 2 pianos that were used primarily. One was an extended range Bösendorfer, which was in a space in Montreal when I was there. And the other one was a really old piano that was given to Joseph Chamberlain, who was the first chancellor of the University of Birmingham, by, I think, Goering or somebody like this. So it was actually came back from Nazi Germany, and it used to have a plaque on it that said this, and then somebody stole the plaque, which we always assumed was some sort of Nazi aficionado or something. And it used to be in the old building, it was there, and it was decrepit. It was falling apart. You know, it was great for prepared piano, or you wanted to experiment or something. You'll hear like scrapes on the strings and things, but it was not in a good way. So the title is just a play on words. So Bösendorfer and also Böse, because we used to jokingly refer to it as the Hitler piano. And so it uses those recordings, and everything comes from pianos, and yeah, this kind of splitting the spectrum around, VBAP panning, granulation, stuff like that. Well, thank you for having me here. It's been fun to talk to you. I hope this is useful in some way. Even if it's just something to think about as you kind of go through all the things that you guys do, which would be nice to hear about a bit sometime too. My email is in there somewhere anyway. So if you want it, it's just i@scottwilson.ca, or my university one is on the website there. But if you want to talk about anything about this, I'm available, or you have my email as well. So, or Chris has my email too. So, okay, thanks again. Thank you. Okay, thank you for watching. That was my talk. It's been a pleasure to be here at DBS in Bristol. If you want more information, my website is scottwilson.ca, or B.E.A.S.T website is beast.bham.ac.uk.